So, just to give you a sense, I wear multiple hats. Here's a selection of the books that I've published previously. And just by way of information, countries in Southeast Asia have different disinformation landscapes and very context-specific fractures that make them vulnerable to exploitation. And so it's very important that we understand the kinds of disinformation campaigns that are being carried out by different actors, including syndicates, terrorists, and even states. I want to tell you a little story about the evening of July 2nd, 2014. A mob surrounded the Sun Tea Shop in Mandalay, which is Myanmar's second largest city. What happened was that the owner, a Muslim, was accused of raping his employee, a woman who was a Buddhist. And he was falsely accused of this rape, but what happened was it was initially posted as a blog, and it was picked up and it went viral when it was posted to Facebook. And when it was posted to Facebook and it was disseminated by right-wing extremist monks, it really took off. But what added fuel to the fire was when the Burmese military also shared the information and posted it to their Facebook pages. As a result, hundreds of people marched to the tea shop and a mob ensued where they turned over cars and the anger rose among the throngs of people. The police attempted to disperse the crowd and move them to other parts of the city. Their efforts, however, were largely unsuccessful, and marauding crowds went through the streets, torching vehicles, ransacking shops with machetes, sticks, causing a great deal of damage. As a result, the police imposed a curfew for the city and the surrounding areas. The authorities feared a repeat of what had happened in 2012 in Rakhine State, in which 200 people were killed and 140,000 Rohingya Muslims were displaced. Interestingly enough, they hadn't learned much from 2012 because in 2012, 5 people, including one of the women who also in 2012 accused a Muslim of raping her, were sent to jail for 21 years for fabricating the story. So despite the fact that this had happened in 2012, we see a repeat of the fake news in 2014, but the difference here was Facebook, and the fact that social media played a large role in whipping up fervor so that instead of 140,000 people being displaced, 655,000 people were. Now, what's interesting is Facebook's reaction to this was to suspend multiple accounts by the Burmese military because the Burmese military had posted many of the most horrific allegations and stories. And no sooner did Facebook suspend the accounts or shutter the pages, what they did, they moved to Russian encrypted platforms like VKontakte and Telegram. Facebook was also accused by the United Nations of promoting the violence and allowing itself to be a platform that had disseminated this fake news and hate speech. The UN said, I'm going to quote, that Facebook had substantively contributed to the level of acrimony amongst Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And furthermore, Mark Zuckerberg, in his testimony before the United States Senate, pledged that they would do more to prevent violence in Burma and that they would add more Burmese-speaking language administrators. But what happened was at the time in 2014, they only had 2. They maxed out with 20. Nevertheless, within 4 months, Reuters discovered that there were still this is after the testimony, Reuters discovered that there were still hundreds of Facebook posts that were calling for a genocide of the Rohingya. They were calling the Muslims in Burma rapists, dogs, maggots, pigs, and that they should be eliminated. And it basically called for the perpetration of a genocide. One post in particular that came from the military said that the Rohingya were Kalar dogs destroying the land, the water, and the Burmese people. We need to destroy their race. So what happens is that the situation in Burma isn't unique in Southeast Asia. Comparably, we have states that engage in fake news campaigns for a variety of reasons, and I'll give you one more example. In the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte used bots, paid accounts, and fake news to disseminate the story that in the day after the 2016 bombing attack in Davao, they had caught the perpetrators. And the reason that he did that was he wanted to justify the draconian measures that had been instituted in the Philippines in the aftermath of the bombing, but also his intention was to undermine the credibility of mainstream media, which did not report the fake capture of the bomber. So state-centered campaigns like we heard from Jen yesterday are intended to sow fear, to shape public opinion, to eviscerate rivals and undermine the alternate sources of information. What's interesting is in both the case of the Philippines and in Burma, the role that Russia played is particularly brutal because Duterte's comm staff had gone to Russia to train in media training. And so what we have then is we have a common theme that the Russians have played a particularly pervasive role. So why do we think social media is critical? For those of you who are more familiar with my work on terrorism, I've been studying ISIS's encrypted apps now for about 4 years. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that because this research is funded by the Department of Defense, I do not represent the DoD, I don't represent the US government, especially not this one. I don't represent the Navy or Minerva, so all mistakes I make are my own. And so that's my disclaimer. You know, it's like Mission Impossible. I have to disclaim just in case something happens. But we know that the role of social media was critical and that ISIS media men admitted as much. Now, the other thing that we are finding out is that ISIS, in addition to the Taliban in Pakistan and the Taliban in Afghanistan, have engaged in campaigns against vaccinations. So, for example, the American stature as a leader of global health is being challenged. It's not just about terrorism, but it's also about their impact on the daily lives of people. So whereas the Gates Foundation had made it its goal to eradicate polio, and they got really close, what ISIS and the Taliban started to do is to use fake news in order to target the inoculators and make sure that the polio campaigns failed. Social media was also used in order to whip up, support for the Islamic State. And so one of the things that was mentioned earlier yesterday was that we see that there is this connection, that something can go viral as fake news or even legitimate news, but goes viral in one platform and spreads. This picture here, technically in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia counts. This is Khalid Sharoof, at the time his 8-year-old son, and also in 2014, holding up a severed head. And he tweeted, "That's my boy." And so what happened was it went from Twitter, within hours, it was in every newspaper in Australia, and it was reported in every media outlet. And in fact, probably everyone is familiar or remembers this story. And the reason that social media is so critical is because there's no checks and balances with social media. Very rarely do we have fact checks that can say, this is fake news. And in the absence of that, it allows social media to be used for disinformation and malign information campaigns in ways that we've never seen. So this is where it's not just the state actors that Jen was talking about, where we know Russia is responsible for 72% of the fake news, of the stories that were disseminated in the study that was done by Martin and Shapiro that he cited yesterday. But also we know, in addition to Russia, China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are the next leaders in terms of spreading fake news. We also see not just states, but terrorists. Now, if I was to show you Southeast Asia in terms of a heat map, this is where we have some of the traffic that we can track with regard to where is the most dissemination of propaganda and fake news coming from, between Australia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and so on. And interestingly enough, it was very early on, probably around 2017, before the so-called end of the caliphate, or the end of its ability to control parts of Syria and Iraq, that we saw they set their sights on Indonesia and the Philippines. And in fact, the jihadi groups are operating in the Indo-Pacific area, producing material in the native languages. And so all of a sudden, there's been a proliferation of Tagalog and other Bahasa Indonesia and other languages that are native to the region that are disseminating the same kinds of Dabiq and ISIS propaganda that we saw before. And understanding this global-local intersection allows us to understand the underlying drivers, not just of the fake news, but also the connection between fake news, malign information campaigns, and radicalization. But we can't forget the offline. As we focus on online, we have to understand ISIS knew very well you pair it. You don't just have online Dabiq, you have printed al-Naba, Dabiq, and you see even this production of the videos, because we know that the media foundations for ISIS produce these very long videos. What would happen is they were producing and reproducing those when they controlled the caliphate. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're emulating the same tactic now in Southeast Asia. Why is offline important? Well, the complex infrastructure of media points, publishing houses, and distribution practices show us that it's not only one platform and that there's an agility. We see this even in the United States with the extreme right wing, where you shutter one platform and they move to another. You close 8chan, they move to TikTok. And so many of these bad actors that are both either non-state actors like terrorist groups or even states have the agility to move from one platform to the next. So we can't just focus all of our efforts in one space. That also, and this is true for states as well, one of the reasons for disinformation campaigns is to undermine the credibility of the mainstream media. Well, when you remove rival sources of information, what it allows you to do is control the message. And if people have no opportunity to challenge what is being said, it does come across that whatever they're hearing is the truth, because there's no alternative to the information that they receive. It's a kind of systematic indoctrination, or what we would call brainwashing. It's this repetition of the message over and over again to such an extent that either the mimetic properties or the fact that the brain naturally starts to believe, oh, you know, I've heard that before. That does sound familiar. And so it's one of the ways in which people can be convinced, even the most outlandish stories, like, for instance, not inoculating your children. I actually personally, living in the United States, find it interesting that the terrorists are anti-vaxxers. I think that's something that we should tell Jenny McCarthy, for the Americans in the room that got that joke. All right, and then finally, this aspect of the Islamic State's offline production of malign information was largely ignored. And I think it's one of the things that we shouldn't ignore moving into the future as we look at other regions. All right, and I'm gonna finish up. I timed this. All right, so, lastly, okay, so terrorist groups like state actors have embraced a gamut of digital communications, including internet-aided influence operations that impact communities around the globe by spreading disinformation, recruiting new supporters, and strengthening their existing vanguard. A key to this influence operation is the ability to identify these emerging sources and influence and beliefs, and if necessary, combat them. And it becomes very important as we identify these emerging beliefs to identify which ones are pro, anti, neutral, and for what ends. Jihadi groups in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, are using these influence campaigns basically to target vulnerable audiences. And so it's about projection of power and influence and the ability to target any community that they want at any given moment. And so what it does is it's not just about national security issue, because it's also about global health. It's also about women's rights and reproductive rights. And so it starts to have a spillover effect that these malign information campaigns are pernicious on every different level. At this point, I'm going to stop before I go well over my time, and I want to thank everyone for your attention for this brand new project, which I've just started, and I also want to thank Colin Clark for all of his assistance in the research in order for me to present this to you today. Thank you again.